From high well to Liberia's laterite soils and tropical climate. It also reduced labor costs at a time when the company was slashing its investments. In a big gamble on the future, Harvey Jr. also ordered that more than 3 million young rubber trees, covering 16,000 acres, be cut down to 3-foot-high stumps. Apprised of the latest developments in the rubber industry, the Princeton graduate decided to try grafting buds from high-yield Sumatran rubber trees onto the Liberian rootstock. If successful, the manufactured clones, once mature, would double the plantation's yield. Clones were a new technology in rubber production. The first experiments with bud grafting of high-yielding rubber trees onto established rootstocks occurred in 1918 in Sumatra. Results were uncertain, but promising. Unable to get enough seed from the Mount Barkley plantation for expansion, Harvey Jr. sent John Lecato, a young graduate in horticulture from the University of Illinois, to Sumatra in the fall of 1928. He was directed to purchase 10,000 plants of 3 different clones recently developed at a private research station in the Dutch East Indies. Each certified clone promised yields upward of 1,000 pounds per acre when mature, twice the yield coming out of Mount Barkley. None of the Sumatran planters or scientists believed that Lecato could successfully transport the rubber tree clones to Liberia. If the venture is successful, they claimed, it will rank with the feat of Henry Wickham, who in an act of biopiracy had taken Hevea brasiliensis from Brazil and placed it into the hands of the British Empire. On a 6-week journey across the Indian Ocean, over the Red Sea, through the Straits of Gibraltar, and on to Monrovia, less than 4% of the plants had died. Transported by truck and surfboat to Division No. 7, the seedlings were planted in 3 separate mother tree seed areas. A quiet revolution was underway on the plantations. A small crew of staff and laborers engineered and constructed upward of 3 million bud-grafted rubber trees. Harvey Jr. would need to wait 7 years for the clones to reach maturity, when their prized white gold could be tapped to know if his bet had paid off. Growing rubber was, in short, a risky business. Harvey Firestone Sr. had raised horses. He had watched his father run a successful farm, trading in sheep, corn, oats, and wheat. But a tree crop, like rubber, was a quite different venture. The Firestone Company neither owned the land nor controlled the labor where the rubber trees had taken root. Protecting its investment became an obsession with Harvey Sr. and Harvey Jr. during the Depression years. The father often claimed Liberia to be a moral protectorate, if not a direct protectorate, of the United States. Together, father and son would use their money, influence, and power to try and turn that misguided belief into a reality in their scramble for land and power in Liberia. In the late 1920s, the company whose designs for success depended on unsavory labor practices decided to consolidate its position in Liberia through an attack on forced labor. Strong, whose work on Firestone's behalf had ingratiated him to father and son, had no qualms about using his Harvard position and ties to the Republican Party to advance Firestone's interests by meddling on humanitarian grounds in the affairs of Liberia. Strong's accusations of labor abuses in Liberia, his ties to White House inner circles, and his friendship with Firestone all played decisive roles in Assistant Secretary of State William Castle's instructions in June 1928 to William Francis to begin an absolutely secret and strictly confidential investigation into the use of forced labor in Liberia. Castle was hardly ignorant of the labor challenges posed by industrial plantations. His grandfather, Samuel Northrop Castle, was a founding partner in Castle and Cook, one of Hawaii's Big 5 sugarcane growing and processing corporations. Although Castle expressed confidence that Firestone was conscientiously operating in Liberia so as to avoid any charge of peonage or forced labor, He nevertheless asked Francis to include the practices of Firestone, as well as those of the Liberian government, in his intelligence gathering. Castle worried about a time when the State Department and Firestone might be held responsible for conditions under which forced labor prevailed, particularly with respect to work on the plantations. When that day comes, the Hawaii-born diplomat warned, it seems highly important that the U.S. government be in a position to show beyond question where the responsibility for such conditions rests and be able to show that American influence has been exerted against such conditions. That day came sooner than even Castle perhaps anticipated. Francis's undercover work had barely begun when Raymond Buell, a young left-leaning Princeton-trained political scientist, delivered a speech at Williams College in western Massachusetts. Buell had recently published The Native Problem in Africa, a comprehensive 2-volume study of the economic, political, and social conditions arising from colonial rule that Africa's indigenous peoples faced. Commissioned by the Committee of International Research of Harvard University and Radcliffe College, with funding by the Rockefeller Foundation, the book was based on a 15-month investigative trip Buell made to Africa, where he visited 18 territories, each occupied by Britain, France, or Belgium, and the Republic of Liberia. His analysis of the Firestone concession and the U.S. State Department's role in influencing the company's negotiations with the Liberian government was particularly hard-hitting. His remarks, prepared for a conference hosted by the Williamstown Institute of Politics in August 1928, elaborated on the charges outlined in his book. Buell, an international relations expert, accused then Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover of using his power in the U.S. government to pressure Liberian officials to accept a deal greatly beneficial to an American manufacturer, but costly to Liberia. Everywhere in Africa where Buell had observed the plantation system, confiscation of indigenous land, and coercion and mistreatment of laborers had occurred. The United States may soon find itself in the position of fostering conditions in Liberia which will make forced labor for private profit inevitable, Buell declared, and at the same time of shielding Liberia from the efforts of the outside world to protect the native population. A company and a government had colluded to throw its influence against the native farmer in favor of the outside capitalist. This was blatant economic imperialism. It was a scheme, Buell predicted, that might sooner or later make Liberia into another Haiti or Nicaragua, a reference to the U.S. military occupation of both countries that was carried out in part to protect American private investment. Somehow, government officials had gotten wind of Buell's plans and alerted Firestone. Behind the scenes, the State Department and Firestone worked furiously at damage control in the 2 weeks leading up to Buell's lecture. Should President King be willing to issue a rebuttal to Buell's accusations, the State Department advised Francis the Associated Press was primed and ready to publish it. Strong had also contemplated going to Williamstown to refute Buell's claims. In the end, he told Castle he thought it better not to call any further attention to his expressed ideas. On the day of Buell's speech, the State Department obtained an advance copy of Buell's remarks and excerpted and telegraphed the most stinging assertions to Harvey Firestone, Jr., urging him to wire the text to Bill Hines in Monrovia. Meanwhile, Castle alerted Francis and called upon him to meet with King and Hines to arrange a press release for publication in the next day's papers. Together, the Firestone manager and the U.S. minister convinced King to come to the defense of both Firestone and the State Department. Hines, a former newspaper reporter, undoubtedly advised King on language sure to persuade the American public. King's statement, sent out over the Associated Press wire, categorically denied any influence on the part of the State Department in compelling the granting of the Firestone concessions. The Liberian president also declared Buell's accusations that the scheme involved the control of Liberia by American officials to be untrue and mischievous. Furthermore, in an added embellishment, King flatly rejected any suggestion of forced labor. Far from suffering a dearth of laborers, the Firestone plantations are suffering from an embarrassment of riches, proclaimed the savvy politician. King took particular offense that an outsider, who spent no more than 15 days in the country, had the arrogance to predict Liberia's future and impugn the soundness and integrity of its statesmen. Needless to say, Firestone and the State Department were pleased by President King's statement and the reception it received. A disaster had been averted. But the Buell episode made clear that if Firestone's operations were to succeed in garnering favorable public opinion and producing a needed rubber supply for America, the company had to distance itself from labor practices that had the whiff of plantation slavery. If conditions of forced labor existed, the blame needed to be placed not on Firestone, but on the Liberian government. Francis spent 9 months gaining the trust of Liberian confidants, perusing available government documents, reading Liberian newspapers and confidential radiograms, listening to rumors, and carefully observing business dealings, shipping manifests, and government revenues. Through these intensive efforts, he had privately amassed enough evidence of forced labor by Liberian government officials to recommend action. In a strictly confidential report, which he delivered to Castle in early March 1929, Francis concluded that officials of the Liberian government have knowledge of, are engaged in, and are making large sums of money by the exportation of forced labor, which has developed into a condition analogous to slavery. Francis had focused his attention, in particular, on an export labor scheme, agreed to by Liberia and Spain in 1914. Provisions of the agreement required the Liberian government to supply a certain number of laborers each year to work the cocoa plantations on the Spanish colony of Fernando Po, an island in the Gulf of Guinea. The terms of employment were for 1 to 2 years. In exchange, the Spanish government guaranteed payment of the laborers' wages, plus a head tax of $4 per man, to the Liberian government. Liberian recruiting agents were also paid $5 for each laborer they brought forth. In a country desperate for cash, labor became an important export commodity. But contracting out labor by the government created a system open to widespread abuse. Word of one such case of abuse reached Francis shortly after his arrival in Liberia from the U.S. in November 1927 to take up the post of U.S. Minister Resident and Consul to Liberia. Samuel Ross, former vice president under King, obtained an executive sanction that enabled him to secure a contract with the Spanish chargé d'affaires for 1,000 laborers for Fernando Po. Unable to recruit workers in southeastern Liberia voluntarily, Ross wove a web of entrapment. His agents would enter a village with soldiers and demand that the chief send rice, along with porters to carry it to the coast to be sold to pay off the town's hut taxes. When the approximately 300 porters arrived at the coast, the Liberian Frontier Force placed them in barricades to await the transport to Fernando Po. Liberian Postmaster General Reginald Sherman, who happened to be in the coastal area at the time, implored Secretary of State Edwin Barclay, nephew of former Liberian President and Firestone lawyer Arthur Barclay, by radiogram to deny the former Vice President permission to ship the imprisoned men. Shall we whose fathers founded this country to secure liberty for their sons encourage this blighted and cursed practice which is ruining our country? Sherman asked. Barclay complied with Sherman's request, but a few months later, the Postmaster General was stripped of his position, and Ross was appointed in his place. Stories of the coercion and mistreatment of laborers for export in Liberia had been relayed on occasion to Washington, D.C., more so after the United States helped finance a 1912 international loan and became more vested in the country. But after Firestone arrived in Liberia, the U.S. government paid much closer attention to such allegations of abuse. Two issues were at play. First, rubber had a quite recent bloody past. The atrocities committed under the command of Belgium's King Leopold 20 years earlier claimed an estimated 10 million lives in the brutal extraction of wild rubber from the Belgian Congo. International headlines galvanized a worldwide movement against slave labor. Given the strong-arm tactics often used by labor recruiting agents, Firestone could knowingly or unknowingly easily find itself caught up in a forced labor scandal. Second, Firestone's need for voluntary free labor competed with the kickback schemes that profited Liberian government officials and chiefs. Putting an end to forced labor practices in Liberia could free up workers in short supply that Firestone desperately needed. It could also help distance the company from any innuendo of building a plantation on unfree labor. In the original Firestone agreements, the Liberian government agreed to encourage, support, and assist Firestone to secure and maintain an adequate labor supply. But the company's presence posed challenges for the government's own labor needs. To facilitate development and extend the government's reach into the interior, President King had undertaken a series of road construction projects not long after the end of the First World War. These projects relied on compulsory labor in accord with the terms of the 1926 Slavery Convention, an international treaty brokered by the League of Nations among its member states to eliminate slavery, the slave trade, and forced labor, but with an exception for public works. Each chief was required to furnish the government, through its district commissioners, with a certain number of men for up to 9 months each year to help build roads by hand without pay, food, or supplies. Young men and sometimes boys moved massive tree roots, rocks, and heavy red clay soil with nothing more than sticks,